Hello everybody and welcome to another video. I've had a really overwhelming response about the Tedros video, so thanks a lot for that. It's really nice to see, although obviously I wish it was about a happier topic. Although I'm kind of bored about talking about the whole virus situation. I think everyone's bored of hearing about it because it's on the news constantly. So now I wanted to make more videos about the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party in general, and more about the problems that it poses on the world stage. And it's actually kind of difficult to find any videos on this on YouTube that aren't just pure propaganda that the CCP themselves have made. And to be honest, I think there's quite a lot of misconceptions about it in general. Because if you don't really understand what they believe or how they justify their actions, you can't really argue against it. And this whole thing obviously involves me talking a lot about the history of the party. I think you need to understand the history in order to understand the ideology. Obviously that means the video ends up being quite long, so I've separated it into two parts. And a little bit about the sources. I'm mostly using the books by Frank Dikotter, his People's Trilogy like Mao's Great Famine, Cultural Revolution, and The Tragedy of Liberation. He's the most well-regarded historian of modern China. And also the book Wealth and Power by Orville Schell. That's enough preamble. I'm going to talk about the main topic of the video. So what is the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party? This kind of sounds like a stupid question, because the name is the Chinese Communist Party. Obviously the ideology is communist. But as we all know, China today does not really resemble anything close to a communist government as it's described by Karl Marx. It has none of the features of collective ownership, the abolition of private property. It maintains a communist government structure, but that's pretty much it. And there are also many things about modern China, even though it's communist, that make it distinctly Chinese. It's quite different to other communist governments that have existed in the past. Obviously, it's quite different to the Soviet Union. First thing to point out is that all governments that adopted communism, they looked back on authoritarian models that they'd had in the past, and then they used them for influence. So, for example, the Soviet Union, when the Bolsheviks adopted communism, they drew influence from Russia under Ivan the Terrible. He had things like labor camps and secret police, this kind of authoritarian measures, and they simply used many of these same techniques that that government had used and remodeled it for the Soviet Union. And it's the same with China. China has a very long history of authoritarianism. In Chinese history, there's loads of colourful examples of evil emperors making like islands of tortured slaves, or sacrificing hundreds of concubines, or killing anybody who didn't get the right haircut. But there are specific doctrines of authoritarianism to create a kind of a moral basis around it. In ancient Chinese philosophy, there's 6 schools of classical thought, and there's really 3 big ones. Most people have heard of Taoism and Confucianism. Taoism comes from a teaching of Lao Tzu, which emphasizes basically oneness with nature, living a healthy life, and striving towards better health and an understanding of nature. And Confucianism, by contrast, emphasizes piety towards your family, loyalty towards your family members, loyalty towards your superiors, and loyalty towards the emperor. So Taoism is very concerned with individual well-being, and Confucianism is concerned with the order of society. Confucianism sort of contains the idea of the emperor being an enlightened ruler who kind of governs with this perceived wisdom for all of humanity. And so the third doctrine, which most people don't know, is called legalism. That's the third big one of these major 3 schools of thought. And legalism, which is sometimes called Fa-Cha, is kind of the Chinese equivalent of realpolitik. Instead of being concerned with nature or filial piety, it's more concerned with how to create bureaucratic structures to create a strong state and create a competent leader. There are other schools of thought like naturalism, Moism, and the School of Names, although they've since become a bit more obscure and they don't really have as much influence on Chinese history. So legalism is really the doctrine that justifies authoritarian rule. It comes from a text written by a minister during the Qin dynasty called Han Fei. And Han Fei's writings on legalism together are known as the Han Feizi. That's the book which makes up this legalist doctrine. And it basically says that instead of the emperor being this enlightened ruler, the emperor should instead be a kind of cog in a bureaucratic machine. A kind of impartial ruler who dishes out rewards and punishments on part of a cohesive system to inspire loyalty. So traitors are all punished incredibly harshly, and loyalty to the emperor is rewarded And he warns against things like the emperor having favourites. For example, bending the rules for people who he likes. The emperor should be completely impartial. There's other things he mentions, which is always attacking the enemy when you have the opportunity, always taking every opportunity to build state power, build state wealth. Never let your opponents know what you're doing. Han Fei was writing in the Qin dynasty. All of these classical ancient Chinese philosophies come from a period called the 100 Schools of Thought, which is around the 3rd century BC when Confucius and Lao Tzu were still alive. That's the Han Feizi. And this was adopted by the Qin dynasty right after the Warring States period. If you're not familiar with Chinese dynasties, because I know they just sound like a bunch of names, I'm going to go through them quickly so you can sort of get a sense of where they are historically. There's the Xia, the Shang, the Zhou, Warring States period, the Qin, the Han, Three Kingdoms, Sui, the Tang, the Song, Mongol invasion, the Yuan, the Ming, the Qing, the Nationalists, then you have Mao, then you have China. So I made a little graph here so you can see where they all line up historically. Anyway, so the Qin dynasty, the 4th one, is the first dynasty to really unify the different kingdoms of China into a cohesive state by someone called Qin Shi Huang. Qin Shi Huang's one of the most important Chinese emperors because he's the first one to really unify China. And he completely adopts this legalist doctrine and the Han Feizi as a model for the Qin dynasty. And all of the Qin emperors were legalists. And because they're legalists, they try to completely remove any influence of Confucianists. Qin Shi Huang famously buries alive 400 Confucian scholars and burns all of the Confucian texts in the empire. He's a very tyrannical ruler. He's the one who creates the Terracotta Army. So, perhaps unsurprisingly, the legalist doctrine was seen as a model for the Communist Party when it took power in 1949. Mao Zedong repeatedly expresses admiration for the legalist doctrine and sees Qin Shi Huang and the other Qin minister, Shang Yang, as a model for communist government in the 20th century. Also, Han Fei, the writer of the legalist doctrine, is reportedly one of Xi Jinping's favourite philosophers. He apparently reads the Han Feizi almost every day, according to some sources. So this is something I think a lot of people aren't aware of. This sort of ancient Chinese philosophical tradition that informs the communist rule in China. So I'm going to go through how this doctrine kind of develops and how it informs the ideology of China today. And so we're going to have to start at the beginning of the development of the CCP. So you kind of have to divide the history of the CCP into 4 different periods. The first period is the foundation period, where the party is founded in 1921, and basically before the communists take power. The second period would be the Maoist period, where Mao is leading the party. That's the high point of the sort of the communist model. Then you have the Deng period, where Deng Xiaoping is running the party from behind the scenes, and you have the opening up period. And then lastly, you'd have the modern period, which you might just call the Xi Jinping period. I'd actually argue that Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin in the 90s and 2000s, that they represent a continuation of Deng's policies, whereas Xi is a more significant break from them. But it's a bit too soon to judge that historically. And so we're going to go through the first 2 of these periods in this video and the next 2 in part 2 of this video. Where does the Chinese Communist Party come from? Well, it grows out of something called the May 4th movement. Just after World War I, the Allied powers, in their negotiations, they grant a port city in China called Qingdao. They give it to the Japanese. This causes a mass outpouring of anger among ordinary Chinese citizens who turn against the Chinese government, which they see as weak and corrupt and incapable of defending them from foreign aggressors, in 1919. And this spawns a whole group of intellectuals who basically become the cutting edge of reform in China. And one of the most prominent of these writers is someone called Chen Dushou. Chen Dushou goes on to found the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. So a little bit about Chen Dushou. He's inspired by previous reform attempts in China. In the late 19th century, you have something in China called the 100 Days Reform. And this is led by 2 reformers called Kang You-wei and Li Qichao. What they do is they basically lobby the emperor in a way to modernize China in a manner similar to what was achieved in Japan during the Meiji Restoration. What they aim to do is to copy Western technology to strengthen the Chinese military and Chinese institutions. But they want to incorporate this with Chinese Confucian culture. And they were able to successfully lobby the emperor into introducing many of these reforms. This was obviously brought about by the Opium Wars and fears of Chinese military weakness. And so the 100 Days Reform is put to an end by the Empress Dowager at the time, who imprisons the real emperor in basically a coup and takes over the Qing dynasty. and most of the reformers are either imprisoned or forced into exile. Later, Chen Dushou is someone who reads Kang Youwei, Li Qichao. He reads about the 100 Days Reformers, and he's inspired by them. So the previous reformers of the 100 Days Reform believed that it was enough for China to simply copy Western technology, whereas what Chen Dushou believes, that it's actually Chinese traditional culture that keeps China backwards, and it's this Confucian way of thinking that stops China from developing. And so this is basically because Confucianism teaches loyalty to the family, loyalty to your superiors, and above all, loyalty to the emperor. And he describes this as being basically a feudal system, where ordinary people just accept their subservience to the emperor, or they can never really do anything to actually inspire honor or inspire national loyalty, because they have a slave mentality that makes them accept their fate, basically. And so him, along with other writers, they see a need for a kind of spiritual revolution in China, rather than just a technological one. And so he starts a magazine called New Youth, which becomes this very popular intellectual movement around Beijing, and actually later publishes an essay by young Mao Zedong while he's working as a librarian assistant in Beijing. And at this time, Chen sees a classical liberal model for China. He wants China to become a scientific democracy, with a constitution and legal institutions like courts, a judiciary, very much in line with what the nationalists wanted to do. But later, after you have the May 4th movement, he very much turns against a lot of these Western ideals. This is also because of World War I, because at that time you have millions of people have been killed for an ideology of nationalism and patriotism. And around the same time, you have Russian communism, Bolshevism, which is very new. And at the time, Bolshevism was actually anti-war. And Russia withdraws all of its troops that were occupying Manchuria. And so by contrast, Russian communism seems like a very good alternative to Western liberalism. Basically because it's very organized. It's anti-war, it's anti-imperialist. Russia appeared to have overcome similar problems to China. Because the early sort of May 4th movement, it's very inspired by kind of Western individualism. Whereas later Chen and others, they sort of say that individualism doesn't give you enough of a driving force to create a political movement, whereas communism seemingly did. And so in 1921, Chen and others together in a meeting house in Shanghai form the Chinese Communist Party of just a few hundred members. And Chen becomes the first chairman of the CCP. At the time, them and the nationalists are very interested in the idea of legalism, but only in the context of developing a kind of rule of law in line with Western ideas of rule of law. It's not until later where it really becomes a kind of integral part of the communist doctrine. A bit of background of the political situation leading up to this. In 1911, you have the Xinhai Revolution, where nationalist revolutionaries, led by Sun Yat-sen, form the KMT, the Kuomintang, which just means the Nationalist Party. And they overthrow local governments, and then they negotiate with the Qing dynasty emperor to hold national elections, which they do very successfully. And so they hold national elections with the KMT participating and the Qing dynasty participating. The KMT win by a large margin, but a Qing dynasty general called Yuan Shikai quickly intervenes and has the lead candidate for the KMT assassinated. He then takes over all the national institutions in China, declares himself president. Sun Yat-sen and the other nationalists flee to Japan, and the KMT is declared an illegal organization, and most of its members imprisoned. A few years later, Yuan Shikai dies anyway of uremia, just trying to quell other revolutions. And so after that, Sun Yat-sen and the KMT, they come back to China and they become the dominant military power. But because of Yuan Shikai's actions, China is plunged into what's called the Warlord period, where local militias all over parts of China seize power over different areas. So the KMT form an alliance with the communists in the 1920s and form what's called the Northern Expedition, which is a military alliance to go north and take back parts of China from the warlords. And so during this alliance, they do remove many of the warlords. But in doing so, the communist local governments start organising peasant uprisings in different provinces. They overthrow local governments and execute many of the landlords and redistribute the land to the peasants. This obviously angers the leaders of the KMT, many of whom themselves are landlords, and they become convinced that the communists are trying to take over the KMT from the inside. Sun Yat-sen dies in 1925, and his successor, Chiang Kai-shek, takes over the KMT, and he's convinced that communists are going to try to take over the party. So he marches on Shanghai, which is under communist control, and kills 5,000 communists there in what becomes known as the Shanghai Massacre, which removes most of the members of the Communist Party, and the survivors flee to Jiangxi. Chen Duxiu at this time is actually having doubts about the communist model for China anyway. He criticizes Stalin's rule as being too dogmatic and too rigid, and so angered by this, Stalin has him removed and replaced with a group of other leaders. Chen then spends the rest of his life in obscurity, and when he dies in the 1940s, no CCP leader goes to his funeral to visit him. He became sort of an embarrassment for the party. And after he left the party and became somewhat rehabilitated in his old age, he went back to believing in democracy and liberalism as the best model for China. He'd experienced totalitarian rule both under the Chinese nationalists and under the Russian communists. Even when he was in power, he repeatedly disagreed with Mao, believing that even if communism came to power in China, that it should do so alongside liberal institutions like a constitution and rule of law and judicial courts. And so Chen represents a kind of idealistic view of communism. It sees it as one of many methods as a way to kind of recreate Chinese national self-image. So I think it's very important to understand that the CCP comes out of this context of a desire to protect China from foreign invasions and to recreate its standing in the world after its so-called century of humiliation. And so that concludes the first part of the CCP's history. Now I'm going to talk a bit about Maoism, what the party was like under Mao.